Hi, I'm Rebecca Kemp Brent. Sometimes my fabric selection in my local area is not exactly what I wanted, and sometimes I enjoy just doing something a little bit special. So I would like to show you one of my favorite tricks for making my own fabric yardage with a quilting design. It sort of gives the look of a lace overlay, and I think that's really fun for certain projects that I'm doing. So we'll go to the software, and first off, I'm going to select my design. I like to choose something that has a lot of lines in it because I'm actually using this as more of an embroidery instead of quilting the sandwich together. And then we can set the number of patterns we want and the number of rows of pattern. And of course, you can set this to anything that you'd like to make as much yardage as you need. And once all of that is set into the program, then we can change to match our fabric width. And then let's change the height so that it's about half a yard. And once you have the pattern on screen, then you can play with it. So I'm going to select different rows, and let's flip every other row. This is a really good thing to do because if you've worked with one-way patterns before where the design has an upside and a down, then you know it's easier to lay out and cut your projects if you have designs pointing in both directions. So that will give me the effect I want. And let's also stagger those designs a little bit. Just to give the pattern a little bit more variety. And I'm going to adjust my pattern height to bring those all closer together. And you can keep playing with this any way you want to. You can do it with alternate rows. I actually have already digitized this in, so I'm going to go pick up that pattern so that I can show you exactly how it looks in the project that I'll be showing you in just a minute. This time when I select the pattern, I can pull up the design that's already created. With all of my size options and with all of the patterns just the way I want them to be. Okay, so here we go, and now I'm ready to stitch. We'll select Quilt as Rows. Usually I would save the session, but since I already have it saved, I'm not doing that this time. So let me position my design on my frame. I got it up a little bit too high. Now I'm ready to sew, and the first step in doing that is always to pull up the bobbin thread. That way I can hold both of the thread tails when I touch sew and start to embroider my pattern. The machine will tie off for me and then go right into the pattern. You'll want to be sure that you set the tension on your machine. It will be a little different for stitching on a single layer of fabric than it is stitching on a quilt sandwich. Some fabrics might need a little bit of stabilizer, and you can either use a spray-on stabilizer or a wash-away stabilizer that goes underneath or on top of your fabric. Now we're going to let this machine stitch for a while, and when the fabric is all finished, it will be ready to use in a project. I've made a really neat parasol, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I put that together. When your fabric is all finished, you just give it a light pressing from the wrong side, and then it's ready to use just like any fabric yardage. I'm using mine to make a great steampunk parasol. It was a lot of fun to do, but I can almost guarantee that your friends will be asking you, how do you do that? Because there's a sort of mystique about putting together a parasol or an umbrella. It's really a more straightforward process than you might think. It works with a pattern just like anything else that you sew. The shape of each of the pieces is the same, and so what I like to do is cut the first piece and then sort of make myself a diagram for how I'm going to lay out the others. I can use that first piece with the embroidered fabric as a template so that I can be sure I get the pattern in the same place on every piece, and that way the pattern goes in a circle all the way around my parasol. The seams on the parasol are sewn together with a serge rolled hem. There are other ways you can do it, but if you have a serger, that's the perfect place to use it. And then I've finished the edges of my parasol with a ruffle. And I have a couple of quick tips I want to give you for how to put a ruffle onto just about anything. You're probably familiar with putting gathering stitches in your fabric, and it's really tempting just to put one row of gathering stitches there. The problem with that is that your gathers will go wonky on you and they won't stay in place while you're stitching them onto your fabric. So we usually put 2 rows of gathering stitches in our ruffles. And when you pull those up, the 2 rows work together to hold the gathers in place. Usually these are 1/8 of an inch inside the seam line and right on the seam line, which has always bothered me because invariably you get a little bit of show where you're going to have to go back and pick out some of those stitches. That's not the fun part of sewing to me. So unless my fabric is one that will hold and show needle holes, I position my 2 lines of gathering, one just inside the seam allowance and one just outside the seam allowance. And that way, although I do have a row of stitches that shows in the finished project, they're easy to pull out because I haven't sewn the seam right on top of it. For this particular project, even easier, I didn't hem my tool. I just used a pinking blade on a rotary cutter to cut the edges. And when I pulled up my gathering stitches, I just overlap with the umbrella, which is already hemmed, and I use a multi-step zigzag to hold the ruffle in place. The final step for making the umbrella or parasol is these little end caps. And you sew one end cap to each of the points of your parasol, and then those just slip right over the ribs of the umbrella. And when you get that done, you're all finished, and you have an umbrella that you can use in the sun or to provide a little shade. Be sure you go to our website where you can find instructions for making the lace inserts I put in my parasol as well. I hope you'll have as much fun with the project as I did.